We are talking Witch of the Woods, also known as Alone in the Woods. This is starring, written, produced and co-directed by Douglas Rouillard, who plays a character called Douglas. And it's a low-budget kind of horror mystery and focuses on this guy called Douglas, who just gets fired from his job. He splits up with his girlfriend, decides he needs a break, so he's living in Boston and he decides to go into the country kind of north of Salem to essentially have some time on his own. And he kind of books up this bed and breakfast, and when he goes there, there's no one else there, but he's been told that it's nearly fully booked, there's only one room left, but there's no one there. But he goes in and he makes the best of it. And he soon finds he's kind of plagued with visions, particularly of a kind of a cloaked figure standing in the kind of the garden staring at him. He comes across this kind of shrine near this kind of graveyard, so decides to steal this box and open it up, and ultimately ends up kind of getting somewhat cursed by this spirit of this witch, which was executed in the Salem witch trials in the 17th century. What'll happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss. Okay, so this is clearly a low budget movie, and obviously I've listed the all the kind of the credits there, and it's obviously more or less a one-man show. And I'm always a bit nervous when I'm reviewing lower budget one-man show style movies, because I always feel that it's likely that this is going to be just what he wants to do, or just what the filmmaker wants to do, without really having any pushback. Now, it's a low budget film, so there are sort of limitations on resources here. What can we say that works? I will say this character of Douglas is actually quite a likeable character. I actually quite like the fact that, we see him getting sacked from his job, he splits up with his girlfriend, but he's not like all depressed or anything like that. He's just a little bit like, I just need a bit of a break. And when he kind of comes across things, he's quite pleasant. He goes into various kind of shops and things like that. He's a little bit maybe kind of his head's elsewhere, so to speak, but he's still, he's not letting it kind of get on top of him, which I thought was actually quite a nice change. So he comes across as just a very kind of like normal guy that just wants to kind of get away from this kind of chapter of his life, so to speak. He wants to go away, for a bit. So I quite liked his character, and it's more or less all from his point of view. There's rarely ever a scene without this character in there. But he's quite a kind of likeable and relatable sort of character. There are a couple of kind of creepy moments and creepy visuals, which I will emphasise I'm quite impressed with, given the clearly very low budget of this movie. And there are some kind of like fun sequences that, for example, where we have this like ghostly figure, so to speak, that he kind of sees out in the garden, and he calls the police, and he can see it, but the police can't see it, and they're right there. And he's like, look, I'm literally looking at it right now, and the police is like, what? And I just thought that was a little, it was quite good. It's a little different from the sort of like, oh, they're gone. He can see it, but no one else can. But there are a couple of other kind of moments where I did think that kind of like there are some sort of creepy imagery kind of peppered through the kind of movie, and it does present as a somewhat of a mystery. Obviously the fact that it's kind of taking place in kind of Salem, where that obviously does have somewhat of a sordid past, you might say, gives it this kind of like this kind of creepy kind of feel. And it's a sort of slow paced movie, but it's done at a very leisurely kind of like tempo, where you just feel this guy is just kind of like happening upon this kind of stuff, and sort of just finds it interesting, so kind of just to fill out his now plenty of time that he's got free, because he's got sacked from his job. He's just kind of looking around, and I just quite like that kind of aspect of it. What doesn't work? Okay, so this is, as mentioned, is a low budget film, and it does show. And as I've mentioned, the director or the co-director is also the producer, the writer, the star, and does various other kind of tasks behind the camera. And it does show, because you have this kind of like, there's decisions that are made here that I would have pushed back on. Now this is why you need a producer to sort of say, you know, we need to not do that because it's not commercially viable, or I know that's the vision that you want, but maybe other people won't kind of get it. That's what a producer is, one of their roles that they should be doing. And when you get these one-man bands, you find that they just don't have anyone that will say no to them. And this is true of this film. For a start, it is a long film. It's 2 hours long with very little plot. So it comes quite a chore at sometimes to kind of sit with, because you really feel like there's not a lot of forward momentum, or you're just kind of repeating very, very similar scenes over and over again. Now this is clearly the film that the director, you know, writer, producer, actor wanted to make, but for an outside audience it's just like meandering. It's just kind of like treading water a lot of the times. This could have been like a 70-minute, 75-minute film, and you would have lost no story. You know, you would have actually been, you know, you wouldn't have missed any beats in regards to the kind of the story here. But as a 2-hour film with not a lot actually happening, it gets a little tiresome to have to kind of to watch. Now, that's not the only thing. Again, this is maybe the inexperience here. I think Douglas is primarily worked as a kind of a bit part actor. There's technical elements here that I feel are really quite amateurish. For example, you'll see different kind of camera angles, and the quality of the footage will vary depending on obviously the camera angle and the camera that is used. Some will be more clear, some will be grainy, some will be kind of out of focus, or you're flipping between various camera angles. You really are noticing a kind of a difference. This is not a found footage movie, so you can't blame that. Also, this is true of the kind of the audio here. The audio, I've got to say, is a mixed bag, because there's the audio doesn't pick up fantastic on some shots. Some shots it's fine. Very much like the kind of the visuals here, there are some audio problems. The acting, I actually didn't have a problem with our main character, I will say. And to be fair, he is like by far and away really the only prominent character. We get a few interactions with a couple of minor characters here and there, and I will say I think the smaller characters acting are kind of like, you know, they're not brilliant. I mean, I've mentioned a couple of times in videos as well how sometimes people aren't given directions about their body language and how they're kind of like sort of standing around looking awkward. They kind of look like NPCs, and you'll have, for example, a couple of shopkeepers, and they kind of look like NPCs is the best way I'll describe it, because they're just kind of standing around looking awkward. They haven't been given direction about, you know, what to do, like start, you know, doing something with your hands, or start checking something off, or you're putting stock out, or whatever it is. They're just kind of there with their arms like swaying unnaturally, looking kind of awkward. And that's that sort of lack of kind of direction in things like this. I did mention that I liked some of the visuals, but there are some here that look incredibly like silly. There's one sequence where we have our character laying down, and we have this kind of like figure that kind of floats on top of him. It looks terrible. I would have just cut that out and just, you know, just like not have it in there. Some of the visuals are actually okay, and some of them are kind of like you know, variable, but you can kind of forgive it for a low budget movie. But some of them are just terrible. The story itself has some compelling elements, but because it's a long film and there isn't a huge amount of kind of progression in the story, you kind of get a bit bored. And then I have to be honest with you as well, it's one of those films like, you know, the point of, I mentioned this in earlier on, where we have our character who sees like a figure that the police can't see. At that point you'd be out. You're thinking, right, I mean, you already experienced a couple of weird things at that point. You know, we've booked in this kind of like bed and breakfast where there's literally no one else there. You've even got to make your own breakfast. You'd be out. You just go, no, I'm seeing things like, you're just going to go. You don't hang around. And I feel strange that he's just stolen this kind of like, this kind of box, which is next to this kind of shrine, which is right next to a gravestone, like a graveyard. So probably, you know, is some type of grave or something. It's like, why would you just steal a box from a grave? I suppose some people would, but, you know, it's just kind of like, well, I can't imagine that's been there for centuries. It's literally just off the path of this graveyard, and if there was like a box in the grave, surely you would think it's some sort of personal thing that someone's left. You know, it's a little bit kind of like uncool to steal something like that and then kind of like expect us as an audience to kind of empathise with the character who's just done that. It just seems very disrespectful. I know it's a horror film, I know that's kind of, that didn't really happen, but you got to think like he's kind of like comes across as quite a kind of down-up guy until that point. There are scenes with like his friend at the office who's he talked to on the phone a couple of times. Pointless, doesn't go anywhere. Cut that out. It doesn't need to happen because there's the film that goes nowhere. That storyline. So it's just a kind of, it needed to have a producer on this movie to cut back on some of these kind of impulses, to have this vision of the film that this director wanted to make. I actually think there's a reasonably interesting kind of like story in there, but it needed to be cut down and kind of like you know, had a little bit more work done onto it. And I definitely think this is a good example of where you need another producer to kind of like to push back on the impulses from filmmakers. And this is especially true of low budget indies, because you don't really have like test audiences and stuff like that, and you really are just left up to your own devices. You know, I used to work in marketing, and I always used to I had to come up with slogans, and I'd always used to test slogans with someone who had no knowledge of what I was doing and see if they kind of understood it. And it's kind of a similar thing with these sort of style of films. They need to be sort of tested with someone who is not connected and will give you honest feedback. As it stands at the moment, it's kind of like there are a couple of good elements in it, but as a whole it's quite dull, quite uneventful to be honest, and somewhat kind of poorly put together and technically somewhat inept as well. So I have to be honest with you, I'll give this one a 3 out of 10, but I do feel that there is a reasonable film in there. 3 out of 10 as it stands at the moment though. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.